Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Lovely to see everyone back after the Pesach break. So I thought for today I did send out an appeal via the WhatsApp groups and for suggestions of topics, and also had various suggestions from I think the end of the last I was going to say the last term, what everyone calls it, the pre-Pesach series. So I thought we'd do a mini series, just maybe a couple of shiurim on Chumra and the place of Chumra in Halacha. Whether it qualifies as life's big questions or not, I don't know, but it is an interesting topic and one worth speaking about. And then after that, I'm tempted to look at, one can give this a number of labels. One can call it determinism, nature, nurture, free will, though we've discussed free will from a different angle before, muzzle, preordained, how much is preordained, that area of life, which I think is probably one of life's big questions and definitely deserves speaking about. So either way, I will look at Chumra for a week or two as a mini series, given that we dealt with quite big topics last time. Pre-Pesach, we finished, I was going to say we finished Zionism, but that sounds wrong. We covered, looked at, explored some topics around Zionism. Okay, so Chumra. Now, some people love Chumras, some people hate Chumras. I just had the word Chumra come up before. I couldn't hear the rest of the conversation, but the words, because it was on my mind, the word Chumra came up. And often it sort of becomes almost like a hashkafic divide or a political divide or a reflection of one's relationship to Judaism or Halacha. And there's a lot to talk about. What are the pros and cons of Chumras? But I think the first area the first discussion we really need to ask is, what is a Chumra? Why is there a concept of Chumra in Halacha? Okay, let's go to the root issue. Why is there a concept of Chumra in Halacha? What is the place of this concept in the halachic system? I mean, I'm not an expert on other legal systems beyond Halacha. When I say I'm not an expert, that's a polite way of saying I know nothing about them. But I'm not aware of situations where you get a bill, certainly I don't. When I get a bill from HMRC and they tell me I have to pay, whatever the figure is, £2,000 to tax, I'm not aware of any inclination or temptation to say, I'd like to be Machmir and pay £2,500 to tax. Or if on the pleasures of Brent Street, I get a £60 parking fine, I don't normally contact Barnes and say, is there any mechanism for me to pay £75 just as my personal Chumra in my relationship to parking. So it's an interesting thing that there is a concept of Chumra at all in Halacha. So this is point number one. Point number two is what makes someone a Machmir? What are we looking for, or what are we tempted to look for when we seek Chumra? And when I say what makes someone a Machmir, really this needs to be divided into two parts. What makes a practitioner a Machmir, meaning in one's personal life, whether as a Rav or a layman, but also what makes a Posek a Machmir? Why are there some Poskim who are more Machmir, some Rabbanim who are more Machmir, some Dayanim who are more Machmir, and some who are more Makel? What does all of this mean? Linked to this a little bit is and this is I think what triggered the question when it was asked to me at the end of pre-Pesach, is sort of an area around the Pesakim of Pesach where there's a genuinely very old Minhag to be Machmir. What would that come from? What would it mean when a Rav or a Beis Din say, under COVID, something was allowed, but in normal years, in extremis, this phrase that sort of circulated, unfortunately, over the last few years around Pesach, what does it mean for a Beis Din to publish a list that says that this year we can use all sorts of things, in previous years we shouldn't have used, and in future years, please God, we won't need to use again. So how does this all, what's going on here? What is the halachic framework around all of this? So let's start from the basics and actually distinguish between two ways that the word Chumra is used. And these are really two concepts, though they overlap a little bit in an interesting way. So a Chumra can, or being Machmir rather more accurately, being Machmir, being stringent. So what do we mean by being stringent? We say something is allowed, me'ika hadin, but nonetheless it's appropriate to be machmir, or I choose to be machmir, I want to be machmir. Is there room to be machmir? You know, sometimes one will get a text that reads, is there room to be machmir about something? And other people are like, is there room to be makel? You know, is there any way to be lenient about this? Is there any argument to be lenient? Is there any way to allow this? Is there any way to not allow this? I get this in all sorts of contexts. Sometimes it's a difficult concept. Someone maybe is going through their yahrzeit year, their Avedis year. They say, is there any way you can tell me that I'm not allowed to go to this wedding? So sometimes you get a question framed in different ways. So one way we mean machmir is we have the core halacha and an additional layer to halacha, which, as I just said, is a strange thing in a legal system, why there should be an optional extra, as it were. The second way we use machmir is when we actually mean core halacha, because a certain posek or certain rav or a certain dayan may be machmir in an area. They may be stringent, and there be another rav who is makel. Now the rav who is machmir, who is being stringent, isn't putting forward his stringency as a stringency. He's saying, I believe the core halacha is that one should adopt the stricter viewpoint. I believe that in this case, my argument, my reasoning is such that one shouldn't do this. And the rav who is makel is saying, my core reasoning is that this is allowed. So when we say I'm machmir on something, we can mean one or two things. Either I recognize that in core halacha this is allowed, but there's an extra layer of strata in which I wish to be machmir, or my view is, or the psak I've received is, that this is in core halacha forbidden. And again, we need to distinguish between the two of these. So let's start with the fundamentals and the concept of a psak halacha and what we mean by psak halacha. And I touched on this near the end of my Shabbos HaGadol, Josh, actually. It probably generated more interest than the rest of the Shabbos HaGadol Josh put together. And I mentioned in passing, how on a practical level does a Rav paskin? What is the nature of a psak halacha? And the truth is there's really four principles at work in terms of psak. Now, I'm not going here, when I say principles at work, obviously a shaila comes up, one needs to research the topics, one needs to research the practicalities of the shaila. It may be as simple as asking the question, what happens exactly, when did you boil the meat in the milky pot and how long has it been left for, and the practical questions, or maybe very sophisticated research in which it's a piece of new technology or new medical application or the like, in which it may take a significant amount of time to understand the technology or the medical circumstances or whatever it may be. So obviously there's a level of research in that, just getting the facts of the question. Then there is research in terms of the sugyas, the relevant halachic topics involved. So it may be, again, it's very clear what the topics involves. It's quite clear that the issue is basar b'cholov, and I just need to make sure I'm up to date with my halachas of basar b'cholov, and then milk and meat, and inevitably I get my psak right. Or it may be a new piece of technology where it's not clear actually what is the question. I don't know if it's something involving use of a certain device on Shabbos. It may be that it's not obvious what are the potential Shabbat issues involved here in this question. And I may need to sort of scan through or think through in one's mind. One may need to think through all the malachas and the drabbanons and the deraisos and the subcategories, the toldos and others, and work out a mukta and spiritual Shabbat and all the various Shabbos halachas to determine actually have I missed something? Have I thought through all the possible halachic ramifications that may be relevant over here in order to give my psak? That's not what I'm talking about over here. This is the research that needs to go into it. But now I've gone through the sugya and I'm aware of all the potential halachic issues. And then you get down to weighing up, how does one rule? Now, it may be that there is an argument, a classic argument, an argument between Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi and Rava. It may be there's an argument in the Rishonim over here, the Rambam and Rashi have different viewpoints. It may be it's a more recent argument, so Shem Zalman said this and Moshe Feinstein said that. And it may be in my own mind, it may be an internal argument. In my own mind, I have a number of ways of looking at this. The Posek in question has a number of ways of looking at this. When I say my, by the way, I'm speaking on behalf of the Posek, I'm not speaking on behalf of myself. And one may have, one may be unsure in one's own mind, effectively have an internal argument about this. So how does one go about paskening? So all the psak really gets down to one of a few simple mechanisms. It may be that there is an argument, it may be that when there is a debate or controversy or different ways of looking at something, the relevant rule would be roiv and miyot. In other words, already the Torah tells us, achrei rabim lahatos, one should follow the majority opinion, and we'll analyze that in a few moments. It may be there is a clearly established minhag. and again, we will analyze that in a few moments. It may be there is clear svara, there is a weight of reasoning that determines how one decides one should paskin, and it may be one is in a situation of doubt, of sofek, and then one will use the rules of doubt, of sofek, to determine how to rule. These are basically the four criteria that halacha uses, that poskim will use to determine Pesach. And actually, one of the differences between different poskim is the relative amount of weighting they give to these different ways of thinking about things, these different classes, these four different mechanisms, as it were, of Pesach. Almost invariably, actually, the difference between poskim comes down to different applications of one of these four rules, or different weighting given to these four rules. That is what Pesach means. That's it. It's obviously complicated in application, but really those are the four tools that a posek will use to make a decision. So let's take them one by one. Now, it is already established in the Torah, achrei rabim lahatos, follow the view, veer towards the view of the majority. This is a posuk in the Torah referencing a particular circumstance. The context of the posuk is that of a beis din sitting together, debating something, and the beis din remains undecided, meaning there are different stances amongst the members of the court, the members of the Sanhedrin, and the Posek says follow the majority rule. This is in probably many legal systems, and I'm no expert on other legal systems, but this is a reasonable principle established in many legal systems. In the Torah, this has the rate of achrei rabim lahatos. Now, the strict application of that to a modern day, or even in absence of a beis din, majority-minority, is not so simple. When you have one beis din, where all the dayanim are speaking directly to each other and debating together, and it has the mechanisms, the formal mechanism of a beis din, there clearly the concept of majority of rov applies to the Torah as established by the Torah legal system, by the halachic system, the mechanism of halacha. Where you have a out of beis din, an extra beis din debate, which is the majority of arguments nowadays, you don't have the poskim sitting together and debating something, and even when they are in discussion with each other, and certainly nowadays, and throughout Jewish history, there's always been letters backwards and forwards, shaylas of controversies across geographical regions. Nonetheless, it's not in the formal structure of beis din. Whether the strict or technical rule of achrei rabim lahatos applies is much less clear. And there are a number of questions about its applicability, including the fact that they haven't all necessarily thrashed things out together. They haven't been in one beis din together where they've been able to debate. There isn't the formal koach hapsak, there isn't the formal ruling authority that a beis din has. And in addition, who would you include in this number count of rov? When you have a beis din, you have a clearly established pool, whether it's a small beis din of 3 or a large beis din of 21, or the Sanhedrin HaGadol, you have a clear group amongst whom you will establish the rov. Whereas when it comes to Pesukim, rulings in scenarios where you don't have a beis din, where you don't have this clear established pool of authority, it's less clear exactly who are you including in this debate. Which poskim would you include in this debate? Who would have the sufficient weighting to be included in this? Which, and what happens if someone new then joins the debate? Another Rav voices opinion, another Rav, and at what point would it shift based on the number of people involved? So the application of achrei rabim lahatos is less clear cut in the post beis din world. We touched on this a little bit when we spoke about Das Torah, because there we spoke about the psukim in Devarim that give authority to the Sanhedrin HaGadol, and Bamokum, etc. The basin that will be next to the Beis Hamikdash in the authorized place, and we discussed the different views of the Rishonim as to what degree there was still a unifying mechanism in existence to this day. I think we saw a machlokas between the view of the Chinuch and the view of the Rambam and so on. We discussed it when we spoke about rabbinic authority and Das Torah. Nowadays, we touched upon this, and there's somewhat of an analogous argument over here. If you remember, for example, both the Ramban and the Chinuch said that there was a need for a body that can decide halacha. Otherwise, you'll end up with a dysfunctional legal system where no one knows what the halacha is because there's a multiplicity of views and no way of determining it. And you'll have shtei Torahs, you'll have two Torahs rather than one unified Torah. So there has to be a limit around how you determine systems, and we saw the different views around this. Now, the truth is, though, that there's two rationales, as it were, for following majority. There's the technical rationale of following majority, as the Posek says. This is the determining source of Pesach of the Beis Din, and that indeed may not, and actually according to probably the majority opinion, is that it does not apply in modern day circumstances, in post Beis Din circumstances, post Sanhedrin circumstances. But there's another reason to follow majority, which is reason. Generally speaking, if the majority of people who have thought through an issue and are qualified to voice an opinion have an opinion about something, the consensus view in general is the correct view around a matter, the consensus of qualified experts. I mean, we all do this in spheres of life in which we have no expertise. All of us have navigated 2 years of having to think about probably medical issues more than we've ever thought before. And in general, the sensible thing for the non-medical layman, we have a medical expert here, but for the rest of us who don't know much about medicine, we have to follow the majority opinion, and that's what makes sense. We follow the consensus. How, as a non-medical person, do I know what's the normal thing to do? I see what the general consensus of doctors is, and if there's a minority opinion, as a layman, I have to adopt the stance that they're probably out of line with the majority. Now, is it possible that the minority is right? Absolutely. I mean, every scientific revolution is engineered by someone who's disagreeing with the consensus. That's how you have you call it a secular shift, a shift in thinking in an area. But that person is an outlier from the layman's point of view until they convince the majority of experts. So it's not that every dissenter is a crank or a conspiracy theorist or crazy in what they're saying. It's simply, as a non-expert, it makes sense for me to follow consensus opinion. And therefore, even if nowadays you don't have the technical majority, certainly you have the logic of majority in certain ways. Now, one distinction between the two types of majority might be that in a Beis Din, even if you have a majority of 1 or 3, that would be enough to be a majority. Whereas in a non-Beis Din scenario, maybe you'd say, if it's a 51% majority, it still remains unresolved in Halacha. If it's a 70, 80% majority, if 80% of Posek can think about something, that's a reason in Halacha to follow their viewpoint, whilst recognizing that nonetheless, there's a chance that 20% are correct. So this is one mechanism in Halacha, one device. And again, I want to emphasize one device. This isn't the only way of paskening, otherwise that would be it. And the degree of weighting that you give to majority also will depend on the style of the posek. And this is one of the core distinctions between different styles of poskim. But it makes sense to follow, if there's a consensus view, it makes sense to follow that. Now, how much weighting you give to the majority will be determined by a number of factors. Will be determined by whether you see yourself as one of the experts or not. So if you are an expert in a field, you may not follow the majority. You may choose to say, I'm part of the minority. Otherwise, you can never have a minority that disagrees with a majority. So a posek will have to weigh up where they see themselves as standing vis-a-vis the debate itself. If they consider themselves a peer of the debaters, then they will voice a minority view, if that's their opinion, based on one of the other 3 factors, like reason and the like, svara and the like, in determining halacha. They're entitled to look through, they are their own experts. If, however, they are an outsider, they see themselves as inferior to the debaters, then they will be in the position, to a greater or lesser degree, of the layman trying to determine the correct position. Again, this is the same as in other fields. A medical expert who isn't an expert in a particular field, if they're not a cardiologist, they will follow perhaps consensus view more or less in cardiology, unless they are able to determine what they consider greater or less experts within the field of cardiology. And in their own field, they will have a view. So again, it's the same thing over here. So a posek may choose to express their own opinion, or they may bow to what they see as more authoritative opinions in the matter. So by convention, in general, for example, poskim won't voice views around the machlokas rishonim or machlokas tanoim or machlokas amoraim. In that area, they will say, we're going to look at what the consensus that has emerged from the rishonim, if there is one, because we don't see ourselves as peers of the rishonim, as authorities vis-a-vis the rishonim, and therefore we won't voice an opinion there. We'll use the principle of rove. Whether if it's a cutting-edge shiloh that's just more recently occurred, and if it's a debate amongst our generation of leaders, then a posek will voice an opinion and not necessarily be interested in the fact that there's a majority of other poskim out there against him. It would give one pause for thought if the majority are against you, any sensible person, but not necessarily stop one voicing opinion. So this is one factor that might affect to what degree you rely on rove, you rely on majority. Another factor might be the degree to which you consider an issue well thrashed out. Now, if the differing opinions haven't spoken to each other, that weakens the power of Rov. To the degree that there's been good communication, freedom of information around the Pesach, the greater degree to which we are sure that each side has heard all the arguments of the other side, the greater degree towards it makes sense. You don't have discrete opinions, but you have a genuine Rov being built up over here. If there's been a lack of information, there hasn't been conversations that have taken place, then again, Rov has less weighting in Halacha. So issues that are well thrashed out, where there's been considerable debate, you wouldn't necessarily follow Rov as soon as the debate comes out. Even if I don't consider myself a peer of the Posek who are arguing it, but the debate is still in its infancy. It hasn't yet been dealt with and thought through and reflected upon, then Rov will be given less weighting. But something that's really been well thrashed out and all the Posek have had each other, and we're sure that positions have solidified and so on, then again, that would make more sense for Rov to take effect. How long does it take for issues to be thrashed out? It really depends on the topic. Sometimes issues are thrashed out quite quickly. Sometimes things can take 20 years or 30 years. I'd say around electricity, for example, there's about 30 years of debate around electricity on Shabbos and Yom Tov before closure began forming. And sometimes, particularly in hashkafic issues, it can take a century for an issue to be resolved. Which is, in the debates between Hasidus and Minhag and so on, there's still divides in the community. But very few of us sort of wish to delegitimize the opposite school of thought. We may say we don't love it. It's not for us. We don't really like every aspect of it. We see its weak side. But maybe people would sort of consider it an illegitimate perspective if that's where one's tradition comes from. And then the other debates that we're still sort of living through. We celebrated last week the Yom Ha'atzmaut, and we're aware that Zionism or aspect of modern Orthodoxy, areas which are still hot debates, and probably over the next 50, 100 years, these areas will, and maybe even now we're seeing some closure of ranks around these things, and many of these debates are not as pressing as they once were. There's much less bashing going on around these things. So, issues take different amounts of time for them to reach some sort of consensus or agreement about how to establish them. But that would be a Rov freedom of information. Another example of this is when manuscripts were lost and then rediscovered. This is another example of this. And there are two schools of thought around this. One school of thought is a manuscript, Chazon Ish put this argument forward, a manuscript was lost and rediscovered should be given less weighting in Halacha, because it's sad, it's unfortunate, it wasn't the fault of the Rishon whose view was lost to history, but it wasn't part of the debate, and therefore this has become a stilled voice. You can't reopen a closed halachic matter because of a lost viewpoint. An alternative viewpoint, at least when something wasn't maybe entirely lost, but wasn't seen by a particular figure, every so often you'll see a great Posek saying, were these other opinions to have known that there was a rashba about this, they would never have disagreed. They surely wouldn't have voiced their opinion. It would have swayed the argument one way or another, and therefore, because there's a lack of information, you can't follow the classic picture of Rov. So where there's been a breakdown in communication, that definitely alters the rubric of using Rov. But this is one tool in deciding halacha, following Rov, whether that's because of the technical or more probably not, but just because of a sort of common sense application of it. You see in the principle of that majority is something that's reasonable to follow, and therefore, even though it doesn't technically apply outside based in, because you don't have a clear pool of participants and the like, nonetheless, following Rov is a tool in Pesach halacha. So this is tool number one. Without over generalizing, it's not, I don't think it'll be a chiddush to anyone here to mention that, for example, when you learn Ramosha Feinstein or Chazon Ish, you very rarely will see them listing 20 opinions or 30 opinions on the matter and deciding based on that, or for that matter of Shem Zalman and many other of the great Posek. You very rarely see them doing a sort of rough count of opinions. You open a Mishnah Berurah, so there's two parts of the Mishnah Berurah. There's the Pesach in the Mishnah Berurah in the section called Mishnah Berurah, and there's the Biur Halacha, the sort of extended essays he wrote on the side, in which he explains in more depth his halachic reasoning or looks at other scenarios. And the Berurah does just that. He will, particularly in areas in which there's a large amount of halachic discussion, perhaps in the Shabbos and the like, he will sometimes in a piece of Biur Halacha list 20 opinions, a vast wealth of knowledge that he possessed, and he will, and not always, but sometimes in a significant amount of cases, he'll say there's a very clear majority on one side or the other, and he'll literally do accounts of views on either side, and to a degree paskin based on that. Now, again, I don't mean to say he's paskin based on 9 against 10, because as I said, if you're not following the technicalities of Rabbi, that doesn't make sense. But he will say if there's 14 viewpoints on one side and 6 on the other, 7 on the other, he will get that quite significant weighting. I'm sorry. In more recent times, most famous of all is, of course, Rabbi Yosef, who, when you learn his teshuvos, you see a complete mastery of all the sources, an incredible photographic memory and computer mind, and on any topic he will bring 60, 70 sources perhaps. And again, he's quite inclined to paskin based on majority of sources. So you see the different sort of feel of Posek. The truth is, I say this more tentatively because once one's going very far back in time, one has to be quite cautious how one views these things. But there seems to be quite a clear divide already in the era of the Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch was effectively co-authored by Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Ramah, Ramosh Isilis in Krakow. Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch. It's another discussion perhaps why it was written then and why it took off at that point in history. But effectively the Shulchan Aruch both heralded the close of an era and was the symptom of a sense that an era had closed. So Jewish history, what closes an era very briefly in Halacha, what closes the era of the Mishnah, what closes the era of the Gemara, what closes the era of the Rishonim is a congruence, a confluence of two different things that happen at the same time. A sense that a generational shift has happened, combined with the work of a genius or geniuses who are able to collate all the previous opinions and summarize them into a document that's or a work that's widely seen as drawing out the conclusions of that previous era of work. Now, the era of the Mishnah and the era of the Mishnah we know a little bit about. We know what sort of events triggered that. It's very interesting, by the way, in history, sometimes you know more about more ancient events than more recent events. It's not always, there's not always like a linear scale of what's known about. So the Mishnah, we know a fair amount about. We know the historical circumstances that led to the sense that the era of the Tanaim had come to an end. It was a very fraught time of Roman persecution and the like. And we know more or less who collated the Mishnah. Again, there's a lot of study out there exactly how it worked, but basically it was a work that was collated of a collection of all the statements of the Tanaim and edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. The Chasimas of Talmud, the closure of the Talmud, is less clear exactly who did that work and exactly when it happened and how it happened. But again, we know more or less the names of the figures involved. But if we go to the era of the Rishonim, which we know a lot about, there were two things that happened. There was the sense of an end of an era. The Spanish, Sephardi world, Spanish and Portuguese world had gone through the trauma of the expulsion from Spain. The Ashkenazi world had gone through about 80 to 100 years before that, a less well-known trauma, but basically for reasons of persecution, a massive population shift from West Europe to East Europe, and the rise of particularly Poland as a massive Machmir Torah, and the relative decline of North France, certainly, and even Germany as a central Machmir Torah, though Germany remains a significant Machmir Torah, and that led to the sense of a sort of break, a rupture, a generational divide. And then the work of genius or geniuses that was seen as collating and assembling all the material together. And this occurred through the co-authorship of the Shulchan Aruch by the Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, and the Ramah, who wrote what he called the Mappa, the tablecloth on the table, which was the lay table of the Shulchan Aruch for Ashkenazim. And between those two combined works, he wrote them as almost footnotes, as we're aware on the Shulchan Aruch. Between these two combined works, one single work appeared because the Ramah chose to interweave his comments into the Shulchan Aruch, and that became accepted to a fair degree as a summation of the previous work. And in a sense, that's both reflected the close of the era of the Rishonim and triggered it, because post that, the discussion now, just like post the writing of the Mishnah, the Amoraim's discussion largely centered around what the Mishnah meant, or post the closure of the Gemara, the discussion largely centered around what the Gemara meant, post the closure of Shulchan Aruch, the discussion largely centered around what the Shulchan Aruch and the collated Rishonim meant. So that's what shifts an era. If you lack one of those two features, an era won't come to a clean end. So the era of the Gaonim, for example, there was a sense that something had changed. And we know, again, the historical circumstances, the move from the Torah center in Bovel to diverse Torah centers in North France and Germany, in Italy and Provence, and Spain and North Africa and the Middle East, so diverse Torah centers. So there was a close of an era, but there was no one work that succeeded in capturing everything that had come before it, for all sorts of reasons, which I'm not going to go into now. And therefore, you didn't have a clean close of era then. And therefore, the authority of the Gaonim, even though seen by the Rishonim as in some way superseding them, it never had a sort of closure of time authority. So if you lack a great work of genius to bring everything together, closure won't happen in as neat a manner. Similarly, if you have a great genius bringing closure, but you don't have the historical readiness for it, it won't work either. And the best example we have of that is the Rambam. The Rambam wrote a Mishnah Torah in which he attempted to bring closure to halachic matters. He writes it explicitly in his introduction to Mishnah Torah. He writes the purpose of this work is to bring closure to all the shaklavataria and debates so that one can draw out practical halacha. And this is the conclusive work. And once this work has been popularized, relatively speaking, the learning of earlier sources will decline, and it will all be about discussions around Mishnah Torah. This was the goal the Rambam set for himself. And again, it's another discussion why he set for himself that goal. Part of the reason, very interestingly, was because he wanted to allow people more time to dedicate to other areas of Torah that he felt had been relatively neglected, like philosophy and theology and so on. But for whatever reason, he tried to bring a work that would close an era or a sense of discussion around a certain era of halacha, and he didn't succeed. For all the stature of the Rambam, for all the prominence given to the Mishnah Torah as an important halachic work, it's not the closing work. And the Shulchan Aruch, which is written by the great Ramon Rabbi Yitzchak, but they're not seen as figures in the league of the Rambam, and it's nowhere near as aesthetically beautiful a work and so on and so forth, achieved the status that the Rambam didn't manage to pull off because the era wasn't ready for it. No one felt that the discussions had been closed. The Rambam was seen as a prince amongst his peers, as an outstandingly great figure, but nonetheless a figure amongst many, and no one was ready at the time to accept this as the closure. And within a short time of the Rambam's death, the Mishnah Torah has been treated very seriously as halachic work. Therefore, was learning it and debating and discussing it. It just became another voice amongst many voices. So you need a great genius isn't enough to close an era. A historical change is enough. You need the confluence of the two. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because even when one looks at the closure brought to the era of the Shonim by the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, one sees, and here I say this tentatively because we're talking about obviously the full sort of the fathers of the halachic system for the last 500 years. But nonetheless, it does look like there's to some degree a difference between the rubric that the Beis Yosef uses in Pesach, Rabbi Yosef Karo uses in Pesach, and then the Ramah uses in Pesach, with Rabbi Yosef Karo again seeming more inclined to follow Roiv, and that's what he gives great weighting to, whereas the Ramah, Moshe Isserlis, gives great weighting to the other aspects of the remaining three elements of Pesach. So just to summarize the first part of what we've said so far, we're looking at Chumra, but we need to understand, to know what Chumra is, we need to understand what Pesach is, and therefore why there are layers of Pesach, which we refer to as Chumra, and what would make one Posek more Machmir and another Posek less Machmir. And to understand that, we're looking at what Pesach is, how does a Posek work? And we said the Posek works through four mechanisms, broadly speaking. One is Rov, one is Minhag, one is Svara, and finally how one deals with doubt, with unresolved issues. And Rov is an important mechanism. It's a mechanism granted authority by the Torah itself under certain circumstances, even if it doesn't have authority outside based in. Nonetheless, there's a logic, a rationale, a reason to follow Rov. It's a good way if consensus emerges. It's a good way of deciding how much weighting does one give to Rov in a world in which poskim aren't able to perfectly talk to each other, in a world that's very scattered, in a world in which poskim think in different ways. Differences between different Sifrei Halacha, and you can open a Ramosha Feinstein or a Chazon Ish or a Bia Halacha or a Rabbi Yosef, or even, dare we say it, back to Rabbi Yosef Karo and the Ramah, and you can see different styles of Pesach, to what degree they're engaged in trying to, in an encyclopedic manner, ensure they've heard every opinion on the subject to weigh it up, or they're less interested in hearing every opinion, and they'll use other tools to determine Halacha. So this is the place of Rov in Halacha. Avram, you're looking worried about this or uncomfortable? Oh, Kristen, fair enough. Okay, so this is one way of paskening. Another way of paskening is Minhag. Now, Minhag means lots and lots and lots of different things. I think we've spoken about Minhag here in this. Have we ever spoken about Minhag in this forum? I did do. I gave a Shabbos to God, I think a Shabbos Shul on a while back. So Minhag is again one of these terms that means too many different things. I don't mean in this context Minhag as in in our family, we have gefilte fish on Friday night, or whether you add chickpeas to your chamim or call it cholent to chamim or not. On that note, let me plug our Thursday night cholent and whiskey gathering. I don't mean minhag like that. I don't even mean minhag that has genuine sort of very serious significance to it. You know, have milky foods on Shavuos, right? We've got Shavuos approaching. You know, having milky foods on Shavuos is a very old minhag. It's not just a trivial minhag. It's a significant minhag. Nonetheless, it's a custom all said and done. It's not a halacha. I don't even mean minhag where minhag crosses the threshold into effectively a drabonon type status, and this is when we touched upon minhag, because when we went through the issues of rabbinic authority, drabonons, not das Torah, but rabbinic legislation, we saw the Rambam who lists minhag as one type of rabbinic legislation where something is accepted by Klal Yisrael and has halachic status. Examples of that to greater or lesser degrees, aspects of the Sfiras Omer, the morning of the Sfiras Omer season, aspects of the morning of the 3 weeks and the 9-day season, Kitnius over Pesach, these sorts of areas. So far we've seen really 3 different sorts of minhag. We've seen minhag referring to just Jewish custom, tradition. We've seen minhag referring to things with halachic status to it, sorry, not halachic, but genuine minhag, significant minhag status like cheesecake, but not halacha also, sorry, not cheesecake, milk on Shavuos, but not nonetheless not halacha, just minhag. And then minhag which has achieved rabbinic status. It's effectively a drabonon takana legislation, even though it was never formally framed in that manner. It became accepted by everyone, like some aspects of the Aveda, some aspects of Avedas during the Omer or the 3 weeks or the 9 days. Some are halacha, but some are effectively drabonons that emerged through minhag. None of those are what I'm talking about as minhag in halacha. Here I'm talking about practice, minhag, that's the meaning of the word minhag, practice, communal practice in following a particular viewpoint. And this is the second way of determining halacha. There is an argument, there's a machlokas between Rishonim or between early Acharonim, and certain communal norms became very clearly established. So everyone does like one viewpoint as opposed to the other viewpoint. That will be a way of determining halacha. So this is the second mechanism of determining halacha. What people do. So there was a debate, a machlokas. I may personally think one side is more reasonable than the other. I may even do a number count of viewpoints and come out that there's a very clear rove one way or another. Nonetheless, Klal Yisrael has paskin. This is the ruling that everyone follows. This is the psak that has emerged. Now, why does this second area of why is this a second way of determining halacha? What's the rationale or reason behind this? So there's 2 ways of looking at the authority of minhag in halacha. And again, I don't mean minhag that has innovated new halacha or new practices like, milk or like on Shavuos or like aspects of the morning, or whatever it is. I mean minhag which is determining halacha in maybe something that's a machlokas in deraisos, let's say. So there's an argument about how to do something what's allowed on Shabbos. And if you look through the sources, you see that 60-70% think this is not allowed, but everyone does it. Why is that a determinant of halacha? Everyone who's part of the halachically caring community. So that's what established minhag. Minhag isn't established by majority Jewish practice if there's been a conscious attempt to ignore halacha, to rewrite halacha, but within the halachically observant community. So why would that determine halacha? So there's a number of reasons why minhag should have weight, but basically divided into 2 classes: practical, pragmatic, and halachic. Pragmatic is the same thing. If everyone does it, then presumably this is because the consensus emerged like this viewpoint. So in a sense, it's a different type of rove. Even though the majority of published opinions, or majority of opinions we're aware of, or perhaps even majority of expert opinions adopt side A, but the majority of practice is like side B. That's what we mean when we say a consensus has emerged, and that probably indicates that even maybe the big names, it was split 70-30, but amongst perhaps the next tier of rabbonim, people who are paskening for their shtetls and for their little communities, people who are adopting one particular stance, perhaps everyone gave great weighting to one opinion over another opinion because they found it at the time more convincing, or that opinion was seen as a senior opinion. So this would establish minhag, and now that's become the halachic norm for the community, and therefore this is a second way of establishing opinion. And in a moment I'll try and give a couple of examples of that, but exactly right. So you see already in the Gemara, this has Gemara sources. Go and see what the people are doing. So what Jews do is what halacha is.
Sometimes saying minhag shtus. And how you give.
Indeed, you're right. Sometimes minhag will be dismissed. If you have something which is, so let me just comment on that. Yeah. Okay. So let's just talk about that for a moment. It is true that if one finds a minhag that has no halachic basis, clearly something has gone wrong, or if you're convinced it has no halachic basis, you have to be a very brave person to say that. But there are poskim who sometimes look at something and say, look, this, yes, we recognize this as a widely held minhag, but it has no grounds whatsoever. So that's already beyond the realm of Pesach. They're simply saying this is a mistake that's crept in. We're not going to discuss it, but one could discuss the strengths and weaknesses of they call it a mimetic tradition in these a tradition that's carried not through books but through lived experiences, particularly in times of rupture. Mimetic traditions break down. So they broke down now post Holocaust in the last generation, post Holocaust, post the big Sephardi immigration from North Africa and the Middle East to Israel. There was such turbulence that Minhagim broke down. Minhagim broke down at the time of the mass movements that I mentioned before, the expulsion of Spain in the Sephardi world, and the move from West to East Europe in the Ashkenazi world. So there are times where sometimes minhagim break down because of massive cultural pressures, so massive persecution or massive cultural pressures. And then poskim will take two stances. Either they will say this is a minhag shlos, it's simply a mistake that's crept in, or they will say a limud zechus. Let's see if we can establish some grounds, even though this isn't what we consider to really be an authoritative practice, but let's see if we can lomed zechut, we can learn merit on this practice. I'm not talking about these extreme situations. I'm talking about a mainstream machlokas where we're all aware that there's two different ways of looking at halacha, and the minhag is like one side, not like the other side. So this is a second school of Posek, because everyone is doing like one opinion over the other opinion. It's clearly not a case where one or the other is mistaken. It's a case where there's two legitimate views. So machlokas, rather than doing the counts of who said what, we look at the minhag and see that everyone follows one viewpoint.
Minhag is really like an application of the other big principles, but sort of the level below authority. So if it was a role, we'd say that. Two people experts in the field. If we're saying it's, maybe the level below might have
adopted one stance, yeah. Yes.
Or they in fact were using Svara over role to advise their killer.
Yes.
So I'm not sure how much Minhag is really actually it's a separate thing. It's something to application. Where it comes from is
in essence, all four tools come down to reason. They're different routes to arrive at reason. So Rove has a halachic mechanism, and reason behind it. Minhag, in a few moments, we'll see, has a halachic mechanism behind it and reason behind it. But all of them, in some degree or other, get down to reasonableness, yes. But just different ways of viewing reasonableness. And that's why I'm categorizing them in the way they are. But you're absolutely right. Okay, so what would establish minhag? As I said, possibly a lower tier who are voting with their feet, possibly facts that we're not aware of, debate that took place that hasn't been recorded, but for some reason consensus emerged like something, or possibly a sense that one of the figures involved in the debate was more convincing or was seen as a greater posek, and therefore their stature gave greater weight to a particular viewpoint. So this is the practical mechanism of it. There's a reasonableness behind following minhag, which is if consensus has emerged, a different sort of consensus, that makes sense to follow. There are also halachic reasons to follow minhag, and this I did speak about in my, I think it's on, I don't know if it's online or not, I can't remember if it took place. I think minhag was recorded, I think it was a Shabbos HaGadol, and it wasn't on Shabbos over COVID. There are also other reasons for following minhag, which have halachic status. Shema b'ni musa avicha, v'al titosh Torah semecha. There's the idea of inherited halachic practice. Halacha is a way of life. It's not just law. It's not just a legal system. If you have something as Torah semecha, musar avicha, as the way the family, the way that your community does things, and this has halachic weight. And then there's another halachic tool that may be relevant over here, which is some form of communal neder that has halachic impact, which is if a community adopts a certain practice or follows a certain halachic stance, they'll be treated as a neder that was accepted almost as a corporate identity upon a whole body, and therefore can bind even future generations, because this became like a communal practice, a takana, effectively a communal institution. So Minhag has two. Minhag has two rationales basically to follow it. One is it's another type of reasonableness or another type of majority almost. Another one is it may carry its own halachic weight in and of in itself because this has become communal practice and the sort of weight of following practice as inherited from our ancestors.
The problem, we're aware of what the Kehillah will stand and what they won't, because they say if they realise that the Kehillah is going to be too much for their stance, then they couldn't impose it. So they did seem to take public opinion into consideration.
Very much so, and we did discuss this briefly when we looked at the power of rabbinic legislation. Here, though, it's sort of superseded or almost trumped by that debate, because we're talking about things that emerged bottom up from the community as to how they paskened, or at least things where we're not aware of the historical circumstances, why this became the minhag. Why did the minhag become to adopt one view over another? It may be we know because it's trashed out, or it may just be because this is what people did, as I said, and you see that this is what people did. In the Ashkenazi world, where minhag was, again, this is an overgeneralization, but minhag was given significant weight. The Ramah will occasionally bring a minhag and will say, I don't know why this arose, but this is what people did, and nonetheless treat that as having halachic weight. So in brief, the second halachic tool, first halachic tool is rov, the second halachic tool is minhag. Now, minhag is also interesting because this is where you can get differences in halachic stance between communities. Rov, in a sense, one would think would be relatively neutral across Klal Yisrael, as long as one's aware of all the opinions. Whereas in minhag, you may have communal practice in one area adopting one position, and another area adopting another position, and that's one of the sources of where you get different Pesach in different areas. Let me give you an example of this. I mentioned already that one of the reasons why you might ignore rov and minhag might have differed from majority is because of a sense of one figure being particularly influential, being particularly decisive. And that decision as to who is particularly authoritative or particularly decisive might have differed from area to area. So the decisive halachic figure who everyone bowed to, in a sense, may have been one person in North Africa and someone else in Poland for obvious reasons. So this is a second halachic tool, and it's one that really brings out the point why different areas can differ. Even rov is impacted by this somewhat, because I already mentioned that when you look at rov, the majority, who do you include in your pool when you don't have a neat based-in structure? And your pool may differ from area to area because you are aware of different authorities or treat them with different weighting. So if you're Ashkenazi, you may know more about the Ashkenazi poskim, or you may give them greater weighting because they're local to you, you've seen them up close and you understand how they work. And therefore your pool may be slightly different to who a Sfardi posek includes in their pool. Okay, so these are two out of the four halachic mechanisms that we are going to look at, rov and minhag. And in minhag certainly, and even in rov, there can be regional differences, but the rationale behind rov is authority of a Posek to some degree, and consensus is reasonable to follow. The rationale behind minhag is, in a sense, like Neil said, it's a different type of rov, it's a different type of consensus, and it may reflect factors of which we are unaware, collective decision-making, stature of the poskim that are involved, and will vary region by region. In Mitzvah Hashem next Sunday, we will look at the remaining two tools of Pesach, Svara and Sofek, and then we will try and understand A, why some poskim end up being more Machmir and others being more Makel, and B, why, as laymen, as it were, or even rabbinic or not, but as practitioners of halacha, what is the concept of us choosing to adopt a Chumra? What does that mean philosophically, theologically? And finally, practically speaking, what are the pros and cons of adopting a Chumra in halacha, and why have different communities taken different stances around to what degree they embrace Chumra or not? So that's the agenda in Mitzvah for next week. I see this may be a 3-week course, not a 2-week thing. A relatively brief one, and then, as I said, after that we'll move on to, if people are interested, maybe matters around providence and determinism and the like. That will, I think, for today, that concludes what we have time to cover.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As always, honored to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.